So this is Western Civ lecture number 4, continuing our discussion of the Cold War. I mentioned the policy of containment and the domino theory that was its application around the world. So we were going to have to, the United States was going to have to stand up to the Soviets wherever they tried to expand. And then I talked about the Truman Doctrine, the idea that the United States would help any country that was non-communist protect itself from being subverted by communism. We would send them money, we would send them weapons, and if necessary, we would send them troops to help them in their fight. So that's the state of play as of the end of 1947. Eastern Europe's in Soviet hands. Things are moving toward the creation of separate governments for Eastern and Western Germany, a communist East Germany, a free British, American, French-oriented West Germany. The Marshall Plan gets underway to help Western Europe recover economically and stave communism off. But I then mentioned that 1949 would be a humdinger of a year. A lot's going to change in 1949 and 1950 with regards to the Cold War. First off, the United States lost its monopoly on atomic weapons. We had the Manhattan Project, which you learned about in great detail during World War II, which had given us usable fission weapons. They were first uranium, then plutonium fission weapons. We had dropped one of each on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan in August of 1945, August 1945, to end World War II in the Pacific. And for the next 2 years, nearly 2 years, we were the only country in the world to possess atomic weapons. That gave us a lot of weight to throw around in the world, and frankly, the Truman administration thought that our monopoly on atomic weapons would cut Joseph Stalin down to size, that he wouldn't be too aggressive if he knew we could bomb him with atom bombs. Well, I know I also mentioned when we were talking about the Manhattan Project that Stalin had spies there. He had spies in Los Alamos, the headquarters of the project, the place where the actual devices were put together. One was a physicist, originally German, then he moved to England, then to the U.S. to work on the project. His name was Klaus Fuchs, F-U-C-H-S. That's German for fox, by the way, Klaus Fuchs. And Fuchs had been funneling information to the Soviet Union for 3 years out of Los Alamos. He would eventually be arrested in Britain, and it would come out what he had done. But that was after the war was over. That was after the Cold War was already underway. So when we found that out, we were very worried. And then the FBI went to work combing its records, looking for other spies, and they found another spy ring, they believed, around Julius Rosenberg. And he was his brother-in-law and his wife. The Rosenbergs would eventually be tried for this, by the way, and both Julius and his wife Ethel would be executed as spies. Very rare in American history, in modern American history, in the last 75 years plus, for anybody to be executed for treason. It's all been unknown. But the Rosenbergs were convicted, and both were electrocuted. There were many people in subsequent decades who thought they'd been railroaded, that it was anti-communist hysteria that doomed them, that they weren't necessarily actually guilty of the crimes they were charged with. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, KGB archives became open for researchers to look into. And what they found was Julius Rosenberg was, in fact, a Soviet spy. He was a real spy. He gave them valuable secrets on our atomic program. But there was no evidence that Ethel, his wife, was actively involved in any spying. And the most, she might have typed up some documents, but she probably didn't understand what she was doing. So, looks like Ethel was probably unjustly executed. Julius Rosenberg was probably guilty of the crimes he was charged with. But in any event, thanks to Fuchs and Rosenberg, and no doubt other spies we don't know, Stalin had a good trail of information about our bomb project, our A-bomb project, so that by the time Harry Truman broke the news to him at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, Stalin may well have known more about the A-bomb than Truman himself did. He'd only been president a couple of months, and he hadn't known a thing about it when he was sworn into office as president upon FDR's death. So Stalin was way up to speed on this, and we know that he already had Soviet scientists working on their own A-bomb using a head start he got from the Manhattan Project leaks. Well, by 1949, those things had come to a head. The Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb, and we found out, they trumpeted the news. There were also radiation in the atmosphere, so we knew that they'd done it. We were no longer the only atomic bomb game in town. And that gave the Soviets a lot of leverage to throw against us now. And they had, by the way, and by 1949, a vastly bigger conventional army than we did. Now, they still haven't recovered fully from World War II, but now that we don't have a monopoly on atomic bombs, people became very concerned. Not to mention that it was known that within a few years, they could probably have bombers. Heck, they had copied our B-29 long-distance bomber almost perfectly to produce a propeller-driven bomber called the Bear. So they could probably drop those bombs on our cities in just a couple of years if they wanted. So the atomic arms race was well and truly on, starting in 1949, truly ratcheting up the Cold War. Another event that happened in 1949 was the fall, quote-unquote, fall of communist China. China had been in the midst of a civil war since the late 1920s. There had been a small but vigorous communist party formed in Shanghai, I believe it was 1922. And by 1929, Mao Zedong, the communist leader in China, had put together a formidable rebel army. And the nationalist government, the main government of China, anti-communist government of China, had its hands full for quite a while with these communist rebels. Eventually, by the mid-30s, they had gotten a hand on them in most parts of China, and in fact driven Mao back into the desert wastelands to the northwest of most of inhabited China. So by the late 30s, it looks like Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, is getting a handle on Mao Zedong and his communist rebels in China. But then the Japanese invaded China, and the nationalist forces have to go to fight the Japanese. And they will spend 6.5, 7 years battling the Japanese invaders, the nationalists will, and wear themselves down. Now, technically, the Maoist communists had signed an agreement with the nationalists to cooperate in fighting the Japanese and not to fight each other. And by and large, the communists did not attack the nationalist Chinese forces under Chiang Kai-shek, but they didn't do anywhere nearly their part in fighting the Japanese. Mao had a long-term strategy. Let the Japanese and the nationalist Chinese fight it out, and when the war is over, he would go to war with whoever had won. And that turned out, of course, to be the Allies, and Chiang Kai-shek was our ally. So at the end of the war, although we had given him and the communist Chinese weapons during the war, one side was much better prepared to fight than the other. Chiang's army was exhausted from years and years of fighting Japan. Mao Zedong's was tanned, rested, and ready, using partly weapons we had given them to fight the Japanese, but they hadn't done much fighting of the Japanese during the war. So in 1947, Mao launched a major offensive against Chiang, and Chiang does his best to hold it off. It takes 4 years, nearly, for Mao to win, but increasingly, thanks to massive Soviet help, arms, not men, weapons came from the Soviet Union to arm Mao's army. We've got now worries about China all over worries about the Soviet Union all over the world. China was thought to be relatively secure. Chiang Kai-shek was our friend, and he'd beaten the Japanese, so we assumed he could handle these rebels in China. And suddenly in 1949, that all changed. Mao's forces swept the field and eventually drove Chiang Kai-shek off the mainland onto the island of Taiwan. Taiwan's, I think it's about 400 or 500 miles off the coast of mainland China, but that became all that was left of nationalist China, was this one island. It would be kind of like if the United States government was driven out of the continental United States and survived only in Hawaii. It was very much like that. Mainland China was in the hands of the communists, Mao Zedong. And Mao set about, he declared a new state. He called it the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China is still the government of China today. It is the government that runs the largest population on earth. And it was founded by Mao Zedong, who went about collectivizing the agricultural sector of his economy, outlawing all private property, all private means of production, government seizure of every industry, full-on Stalinist-style communism. But he'll put a twist on it because most Chinese are still peasants. So he will focus on collectivized farms for the peasants as the main focus of his economy in communist China. So that happened in 1949 too, and Americans did a lot of hand-wringing. How did we lose China? Now, China wasn't really ours to lose in the first place, but many Americans had thought we have a long-standing relationship with China. American missionaries have been in China for 100 years. We had been trading with China for decades and decades, well into the 19th century. And so a lot of Americans were stunned when China went communist. How did we lose it? A lot of people started looking for a scapegoat then. One last thing about the late 40s and the Cold War that I should mention is the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift lasted from, let me see if I can get the exact dates. Oh, sorry, I can't find the precise dates of the... yes, June 1948. Stalin decided to put pressure on the Western Allies by closing off West Berlin from the rest of the Allied sector of Germany. You'll remember the Soviets have northeast Germany, which totally surrounds Berlin. The agreement at the end of World War II had given the western sliver of Berlin to Britain, France, and the United States. But the Soviets controlled all the area around it. Now, America and Britain and France have been allowed to bring supplies and men and the like along a railroad that ran from Western Germany to Berlin. So we had used this railroad for 3 years to move men in and out of Berlin through the Soviet sector. But in June 1948, Stalin cut that off. This becomes known as the Berlin Blockade. Stalin wants to force the U.S., especially Britain and France, our allies, to give in on his demands on Germany, to reduce Germany to an agricultural wasteland, to never let them industrialize, to keep them in the Middle Ages. And he thinks he can do that by trapping our men in West Berlin. Not to mention the fact that we were responsible for feeding and caring for something like 1 million Berlin citizens in the Western sector. With no food, where was the food coming from? Well, Harry Truman called Stalin's bluff. He started an air supply, the Berlin Airlift, which would go on for the better part of a year. And we would bring practically every morsel of food consumed by civilians and Western military personnel in West Berlin. We'd fly them in. They were in a steady stream, 24/7, 365, of cargo planes flying in and out of Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. American Air Force planes, British RAF, bringing in these supplies and keeping West Berlin alive. If Stalin had shot down one of those Western military planes, it could have been the beginning of World War III. He didn't, thankfully. And after realizing that we could, in fact, feed and care for all the people of West Berlin by this airlift, and we were willing to do it months and months on end, he eventually gave in and reopened the railway. It took about a year, nearly a year. But the Berlin Airlift was another sign of this extreme tension, that Germany was the epicenter, but all over the world, the U.S. and communism are at loggerheads. The Cold War is very much on. Now, you notice I haven't told you of any Americans and British soldiers shooting at each other. It's not a hot war, it's a Cold War. But we had now hundreds of thousands of soldiers on each side staring at each other across barricades with machine guns. We had air forces on constant alert. By the end of 1949, it's possible we could be bombed with A-bombs from the Soviet Union. And certainly they were afraid we might bomb them. So this tension, this war footing without actually shooting at each other, that is the Cold War, was well on by 1950. Next time we talk about the Korean War. Thank you.